I'm a 23-year-old woman, married to Henry, 25. We've been together for 5 years now. And honestly, I'm at my breaking point. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's been through something like this, but I need to vent. Let me set the stage. It's our 5th wedding anniversary. You'd think that after 5 years of marriage, a little acknowledgement of the milestone would be a given, right? I mean, I had subtly mentioned it for weeks, casually dropping hints like I can't believe we've been married for 5 years, time flies, or do you think we'll do something special for our anniversary this year? He nodded and gave his usual distracted responses. No big deal, right? I figured he was just busy. But then the day comes and it's like any other day. He didn't say a word, didn't even ask about what I had planned. No flowers, no dinner, nothing. Absolutely nothing. I mean, I had gone all out for our anniversary every year before. I planned surprise dinners, wrote him heartfelt letters, organized thoughtful little gifts. I tried to make it special, but for the past couple of years, it felt like I was the only one making an effort. So I bring it up. I said something along the lines of, hey, I guess we're not celebrating today. And he just laughed it off like it was no big deal. He said, oh, we'll do something later, don't worry. But later never came. It's like the day just passed without him even remembering. I was hurt. I don't know how else to put it, but I was frustrated. I put so much into this marriage, and yet here I am, alone on our anniversary. Just forgotten. That's when things started to spiral. The thing is, he had a business trip that same week. He was supposed to fly out on the 14th for work and return the next evening. As usual, he asked me to pick him up from the airport. At first, I hesitated. I'd been giving him little passive-aggressive hints, but he just didn't seem to care. He kept making jokes about how tired he was from the trip, how he couldn't wait to get home, but didn't acknowledge the anniversary at all. He just kept talking about work like everything was fine. I let the frustration build. Honestly, I was done trying to get through to him. I had been the one doing all the work, making every special day memorable, while he was always too distracted or busy. So, that night, after laying awake for hours, I decided to do something about it. I wasn't going to pick him up from the airport. I made the decision then and there. I wasn't going to reward his disregard for me. Maybe if I stopped being so accommodating, he'd realize how much he was taking me for granted. I didn't text him, didn't call, didn't do anything. When he sent me the usual message about his flight details, time, gate, etc., I didn't even respond. I didn't even acknowledge it. It felt empowering to just not care for a moment. I spent the day doing my own thing, treating myself like I deserved, without thinking about Henry's flight or his return. Around 8 p.m., I got a text from him. Then another. And another. He started calling. Over and over. I just ignored it. Part of me felt guilty, but most of me felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Henry was stranded at the airport with no one to pick him up, and I wasn't about to play the dutiful wife anymore. He could figure it out. Finally, about an hour later, after ignoring his calls for what felt like an eternity, I sent him a text. Oh, sorry. Totally forgot you needed a ride. Happens sometimes. I'll admit, it was a little petty. I'm not proud of that. But after 5 years of constantly putting his needs first, I finally snapped. The words felt almost too sweet, dripping with irony. I knew it would make him furious. And that's exactly what happened. The next text I got was a series of angry rants, calling me petty and irresponsible. He went off about how I was overreacting, how I was being childish. I didn't care. The next few hours were a blur. He finally made his way home, somehow, and when he walked through the door, there was a coldness in the air. He barely acknowledged me. He was still angry, sulking, and I just didn't care anymore. I went to bed early that night, leaving him to his thoughts. The next day was no better. Henry didn't even apologize. He gave the same old excuse about work being stressful, that he just lost track of things. But I wasn't having it. I wasn't going to let him sweep everything under the rug anymore. I wanted to hear him admit that he messed up. I wanted him to realize what he had done. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing was going to change. So, I let him stew in his anger. And me? Well, I felt a strange mixture of guilt and satisfaction. I'm not sure where this will lead, but I can't go back to how things were. Something's got to give. Update 1. So, after I sent Henry that message about forgetting to pick him up, I didn't hear from him for a while. But oh boy, when I did, it wasn't pretty. He started texting, then calling over and over. I ignored every single one. Part of me wanted to just let him stew, but I kept my phone on silent, and hours went by. I wasn't going to rush to pick up the pieces when he was the one who'd ignored me for so long. It wasn't until about 10 p.m. that I finally caved and checked my phone. I had missed around 15 calls and at least 20 texts. Most of them were a mix of him calling me petty, irresponsible, and childish. He was furious. The text that stood out the most was one that said, "You really had to leave me stranded, huh? This is how you treat me after everything I've done for you." I wasn't going to get sucked into that guilt trip. Instead, I responded calmly, "Maybe now you know what it feels like to be forgotten." I didn't add anything more. I knew any further explanation would just be lost on him. Henry tried to defend himself the best he could. His response was classic. "I'm sorry, okay? But I've been busy with work. I didn't mean to forget the anniversary. You know how stressful things have been lately." It was the same excuse he always used, work stress. But this time, it wasn't going to fly. I didn't reply right away. I just let the silence hang between us. After a while, he finally got the hint. But it wasn't until the next morning that I learned just how badly he had been affected by the whole situation. Henry waited at the airport for over 3 hours. Apparently, he tried calling me every half hour during that time. He wasn't able to get a cab right away because he didn't want to waste money on one. Eventually, he broke down and called one, but by the time he got home, it was well after midnight. When he walked through the door, I didn't greet him or try to make small talk. He didn't even look at me. He just walked past me and dropped his suitcase on the floor. It was clear that he was still angry. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. He tried to talk, of course, but it wasn't a conversation. More like a monologue about how unfair I was being. "I've been working hard, and this is how you treat me," he asked. His words were full of frustration, but the excuses just didn't do it for me anymore. I wasn't interested in hearing about how his job was hard when I felt like I had been carrying this relationship on my own for months. The first night back was miserable. We didn't speak much. The only time he really looked at me was when I was getting ready for bed. I could feel his eyes on me, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything. I wasn't going to make the first move. The next day, Henry tried to smooth things over by texting me, saying, "I've been working so much lately, it just slipped my mind. You know how it is. Same old story. Same tired excuse." At this point, it was so obvious that he just wasn't getting it. We barely spoke over the next few days. Every time we did, it felt like he was walking on eggshells. He was passive-aggressive, and I wasn't going to back down either. I had made my point, and I wasn't going to let him convince me that everything was fine just because he threw around a few empty apologies. It didn't help that his mom got involved. She called, asking why Henry had to take a cab home. She was concerned, of course, but it felt more like she was trying to guilt-trip me. "I can't believe you left him there," she said. "He's been working so hard and you just let him figure it out on his own?" I didn't even know how to respond to that, so I didn't. I let the call end and just walked away. Later that evening, Henry tried his best to apologize, but it wasn't genuine. It was forced, almost like he was saying sorry just to end the tension. "I guess I could have done better, but you didn't have to leave me stranded," he said. There was no real accountability, no understanding of why I was upset in the first place. Just another deflection. I wasn't going to settle for a half-hearted apology. I told him, "I'll move past this if you can actually acknowledge what I'm feeling and start being more considerate. It's not just about the anniversary. It's about how you treat me in general." His response? He accused me of overreacting. He said I was making a bigger deal out of this than it was, but I wasn't backing down. After a few more days of silence and tension, I decided to set some boundaries. I needed space to focus on myself, so I started engaging in my own hobbies again. It was a relief to not feel obligated to constantly cater to his moods. Henry wasn't exactly thrilled with this, but he made one last effort to smooth things over. He booked a dinner reservation for the two of us. He said it was to make up for things. I don't know if he genuinely thought it would fix everything, or if it was just a last-ditch attempt to avoid real accountability, but either way, I wasn't sure if it was enough. I was still waiting to see if he was really going to change. Would this be a genuine effort, or just another temporary fix that would fall apart in a few weeks? Update 2. So, after the whole airport incident, Henry finally decided to try and make things right. He booked a dinner reservation at a restaurant, claiming it was to make up for everything that had happened. I won't lie, part of me was cautiously optimistic. Maybe, just maybe, this was the moment he'd finally realize how much he'd hurt me and actually put in some effort. But, as usual, that wasn't the case. The day of the dinner, Henry texted me around noon to let me know the reservation was set for 7 p.m. I didn't really feel any excitement, I was just going through the motions. Maybe it was the fact that this wasn't our first attempt at fixing things, or maybe it was the nagging feeling in my gut that this dinner wouldn't change anything. But I got dressed and decided to give it a chance anyway. At least for one night, maybe things could be different. We arrived at the restaurant, and to my surprise, it wasn't some nice, intimate place like I had hoped. Instead, it was a generic chain restaurant, the kind you go to for casual dinners when you don't feel like trying too hard. It wasn't even a place I liked. I had made it clear before that I wasn't a fan of those types of restaurants, but Henry had picked it anyway. I tried not to let it bother me, but it was hard not to notice the lack of effort. It felt like he had gone for the easiest option, like he couldn't even be bothered to consider what I might enjoy. The conversation started awkwardly. Henry immediately began talking about how stressful his work had been, going on about deadlines and meetings, and how much pressure he was under. He didn't even try to acknowledge the fact that he had forgotten our anniversary or left me stranded at the airport. Instead, he just kept talking about work. He'd mentioned something about how he was doing his best and stressed out, but I couldn't help but feel that he was completely missing the point. He hadn't apologized for the anniversary. He hadn't apologized for making me feel completely invisible. The more he talked about work, the more frustrated I became. It wasn't just that he was ignoring the bigger issue, it was the fact that he didn't seem to realize how much his behavior had affected me. And it hit me harder than ever. I realized in that moment that this wasn't a one-off mistake. This was a pattern. We were sitting there, trying to have a nice dinner, but all I could think about was how out of touch he was with what really mattered. He didn't even seem to understand why I was hurt. It wasn't just about the anniversary. It wasn't just about the airport. It was about all the little things he had neglected over the years, the birthday surprises I planned alone, the holidays we spent apart because he was too busy. Our small talk didn't last long before things started to unravel. We had a small disagreement about the food, but as usual, it turned into something bigger. He got defensive, insisting that I was being too picky and ungrateful. I tried to explain that it wasn't about the food. It wasn't about the restaurant. It was about everything else. That's when it all started to spill out. I told him how I felt ignored, how he never seemed to put any real effort into our relationship. I brought up the anniversaries, the birthdays, the quiet nights where I felt like a background character in his life. But instead of owning up to anything, Henry just deflected. He started talking about how nobody's perfect and how I should just appreciate what I get. And there it was, the excuse I was so tired of hearing. Nobody's perfect. That was the line he always pulled out when things got tough, and this time was no different. When the waiter came by to ask if we needed anything else, I just looked at Henry. His expression was blank. It was clear he wasn't even listening anymore. He gave a token gesture, handing me a small box of chocolates with a half-hearted smile. "Here," he said, "for you. Sorry about everything." It was a nice gesture, I guess, but it felt insincere. A last-minute attempt to make things right without actually doing anything to change the bigger issues between us. I didn't even want the chocolates. I was past the point of small gestures. I needed something real. The rest of the dinner was silent, awkward, and full of empty words. We barely spoke on the drive home. I could feel the tension in the car. Henry was still annoyed, but I wasn't sure if he was more upset with me for calling him out or with himself for not understanding why I was upset in the first place. It didn't matter either way. The silence was deafening. When we got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing had changed. I'd hoped that maybe this time, he'd actually get it. Maybe he'd realize that it wasn't about the little things, it was about the bigger picture. But that hope quickly faded when I looked at him and realized he still didn't see it. Over the next few days, Henry started doing small things around the house. He washed the dishes, helped with the laundry, and did some cleaning. At first, I thought maybe this was a sign that he was trying to change, but it felt more like damage control than anything else. He wasn't doing these things because he genuinely wanted to. He was doing them because he knew I was upset, and he wanted to avoid another confrontation. I found myself emotionally withdrawing more and more. I couldn't help it. I didn't want to keep getting disappointed. I didn't want to keep waiting for him to change when it felt like he wasn't even trying. I didn't want to fix someone who wasn't willing to meet me halfway. A friend of mine suggested that I give Henry an ultimatum. Either he changes, or you walk away, she said. It seemed harsh, but maybe it was the wake-up call he needed. I couldn't keep going on like this, constantly wondering if he was going to make a real effort. As the days passed, Henry's excuses kept piling up. Work, stress, deadlines, those were always his reasons for everything. And I was starting to see a bigger problem. Henry didn't seem to understand the emotional disconnect that had been growing between us. He thought that by doing the bare minimum, everything would be fine. But I knew that wasn't enough anymore. I started to think about our future together. Was this relationship even salvageable? I didn't know anymore. Update 3. After weeks of dealing with the same cycle, empty apologies, half-hearted attempts at change, and more excuses, I reached my breaking point. I couldn't go on like this anymore. I had tried being patient, tried giving him chances to step up, but it was clear that Henry just didn't get it. So I decided to sit him down and have the conversation I should have had months ago. It wasn't easy. I had been putting it off, hoping he'd come to the realization on his own, but that wasn't happening. So one evening, when he got home from work, I told him we needed to talk. There was no getting around this one. We sat down in the living room, and I could feel the tension already building. I didn't want to yell, but I couldn't sugarcoat things anymore. I started by saying, Henry, I can't do this anymore. This relationship has been one-sided for too long. You've ignored me, forgotten important moments, and you never take accountability for any of it. At first, he just stared at me, confused. What are you talking about? He asked. I've been working so hard and you're acting like I'm doing nothing. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. It's not about your work, Henry. It's about how you've treated me. The anniversary? The airport incident? I've tried to make this relationship work for both of us, but you haven't even tried to meet me halfway. Henry immediately went on the defensive, like he always does. You're blowing things out of proportion, he said, his voice rising. You're acting like I forgot your anniversary on purpose. I didn't mean to forget, okay? I've been stressed out with work. I wasn't buying it. It's not just the anniversary, Henry, it's everything. It's every time you make me feel like I'm not important. It's every birthday, every holiday that goes by, and I'm the only one putting in any effort. Henry's face hardened. I'm not perfect, okay? Nobody's perfect. I do what I can. He shifted the blame back on me. Maybe you're just too demanding. Maybe you expect too much from me. His response made me even angrier. I'm not asking for perfection, Henry. I'm asking for basic consideration. I'm asking for respect. I'm asking for you to care about our relationship the way I do. But you don't. And that's what hurts the most. The room was silent for a moment. I could tell that Henry wasn't expecting this kind of conversation. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly not knowing how to respond. I guess I could have done better, he muttered, but it was obvious that he didn't really believe it. He wasn't fully taking responsibility for anything. He wasn't even sorry, he was just saying the words because he knew he had to. I'm not interested in hearing you say you could have done better, I said, keeping my voice steady. I need more than that. I need to know you get it. I need to know you get it. I need you to understand how much your neglect has hurt me. And I need you to show me that you're willing to make an effort. Henry avoided looking at me. He was uncomfortable. I could see it. But I wasn't done. I had one last point to make. If the roles were reversed, Henry, what would you feel? How would you feel if I forgot our anniversary and left you stranded at the airport? For the first time in this whole conversation, he was silent. His mouth opened, but no words came out. I could see the wheels turning in his head, and for a moment, it looked like the truth was finally sinking in. He didn't say anything for a long time, and I let the silence hang in the air. Finally, Henry broke the silence with a quiet, I don't know. I guess I'd be pissed. I nodded. Exactly. That's how I feel. That's how I felt for a long time. I suggested something simple, couples activities like regular date nights or just spending time together to rebuild the connection we used to have. I wanted to see if he was really willing to put in the effort to change things. We can try this, but it's going to take work from both of us. I can't keep carrying this relationship by myself, I said. Henry looked at me, and there was a moment of hesitation. Okay, I'll try, he said, but his tone was flat, like he was just saying what he thought I wanted to hear. I don't know if date nights are going to fix everything, but I'll try. That was it. The lukewarm response I expected. It didn't feel like a commitment, it felt like an obligation. I knew I had to give it a few weeks to see if anything would actually change. I couldn't just take his word for it. The conversation ended on a tense note. Henry didn't seem convinced, and neither was I. We went to bed without much more said, both of us stewing in our own thoughts. I kept wondering if Henry's words were genuine or if he was just saying whatever he thought would get me off his back. I decided to give it time, but in the back of my mind, I knew I couldn't keep waiting forever. I had already put so much into this relationship, and I wasn't sure how much more I could give if things didn't change. I couldn't let myself be stuck in a cycle of disappointment and broken promises. So now I'm just waiting to see if Henry will actually make an effort or if he'll slip back into his old ways. I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know one thing. I won't stick around for another empty promise. Update 4. So after that serious conversation, things seemed to take a turn for a little while. Henry tried harder. He actually planned a small date night, a dinner at a local restaurant we both liked, nothing fancy, but at least it felt like an effort. He also started helping around the house more, doing the dishes without being asked, taking out the trash, and picking up groceries. For a week, things seemed a little better. I even began to think that maybe he was finally starting to get it. Maybe I had been wrong about him. But by the second week, things started to slide back to normal. Henry canceled a planned outing, saying that work had piled up and he just couldn't get away. Again, his work stress was always his go-to excuse. I tried to be understanding, but it was hard not to see it as just another empty excuse. I was frustrated. I had hoped that his efforts in the first week meant something, but now it felt like a temporary fix, something he did just to keep me quiet. The worst part came when Henry forgot another milestone. He didn't remember the day we first met. It wasn't anything huge, just a small thing that mattered to me. I brought it up, casually, but he just shrugged it off like it was no big deal. And in that moment, I realized that he wasn't even trying to keep track of these things anymore. He didn't care about the little moments that used to mean something to both of us. It was just me, trying to hold on to whatever spark we had left, while he seemed to be losing interest. I started questioning everything. Did Henry really care about our marriage? Or was he just assuming that I would always be there? It seemed like he didn't even notice how much I was putting into this. And that thought stung more than I'd like to admit. I wasn't sure anymore if he actually valued me, or if he just took me for granted. One day, while I was tidying up the living room, I found something that made my blood run cold. I came across Henry's calendar, tucked behind some papers on his desk. I don't usually go through his stuff, but something told me to take a look. I saw the date of our anniversary marked on the calendar. But here's the thing, he still forgot it. It was like he had planned for it, made a note of it, but just didn't bother to remember when it actually came around. I was beyond frustrated. I confronted him later that night, asking why he'd marked our anniversary but still managed to forget it. He came up with some weak excuse about forgetting to check his calendar that week. That's what he said, like it was just some innocent mistake. It wasn't a mistake. It was blatant neglect. When I looked at the calendar more closely, I saw what had really been prioritized. There were work deadlines marked, sports events, weekend getaways with friends, but there was hardly anything about us. It was like our relationship didn't even make it onto his radar. I had known that work was always his main focus, but seeing it laid out like that hit harder than I expected. I had been trying so hard to keep things going between us, but it felt like he couldn't be bothered to even try. The final straw came a few days later. I overheard Henry on the phone with a friend talking about a weekend getaway they were planning for a sports event. He was excited about it, talking about the details of the trip like it was the best thing ever. I felt sick to my stomach. This was something he hadn't even mentioned to me. He had time for a weekend getaway with his friends, but he couldn't even remember the little things with me. I tried to push it aside at first, but the more I thought about it, the more betrayed I felt. It wasn't just the fact that he was prioritizing his hobbies, it was that he never even considered how I would feel. He had time and energy for everything else, but when it came to us, it was like I was an afterthought. So I stopped engaging. I stopped making the effort. I stopped texting him throughout the day, stopped trying to make small talk when he got home. I figured if he didn't notice the distance between us, then maybe he never would. I needed him to see what was happening. I needed him to feel what I was feeling. Eventually, our friends started to notice. At first, they were all on Henry's side, saying I was overreacting. But now they were starting to see it too. A few friends reached out to me, saying they understood my frustration, and even admitted that Henry had been selfish. They told me I deserved better, and that's when I realized I wasn't the only one who saw the truth. But things didn't change. The final blow came when Henry canceled our pre-planned dinner date to go to a last-minute event with his friends. He didn't even tell me in person. He texted me an apology, saying he just couldn't say no to the invitation. That was it. That was the moment I realized that I had to make a decision. This wasn't something I could keep putting off. Henry wasn't going to change. Not unless I forced him to. I could keep waiting for him to figure it out, but at what cost? The longer I stayed, the more I felt like I was losing myself. I needed to stop waiting around for a relationship that wasn't fulfilling. So now I'm at a crossroads. I don't know if I'm strong enough to walk away, but I can't keep going like this. The emotional distance has grown so much that I'm not even sure how to fix it anymore. Something has to give. It's time for me to make a drastic decision about my marriage, one that will either force him to wake up or give me the space I need to move on. Update 5. After everything that had happened, I knew it was time to step back and really think about what I wanted. I needed to figure out if I was willing to keep trying in this relationship, or if it was time to walk away for good. So I decided to spend the entire weekend alone. I didn't answer Henry's texts or calls. I didn't even leave the house much. I needed space to think. And this time, I wasn't going to let my emotions drive the decision. It was during that weekend that the truth really hit me. I had been settling for less than I deserved for a long time. I realized how emotionally drained I had become, trying to hold on to something that wasn't even there anymore. The little things I did for Henry, the gestures, the effort, it felt like it was all just going unnoticed. He wasn't putting in any effort to make me feel valued. He wasn't even trying. And the worst part? He didn't even seem to notice that anything was wrong. Henry just went about his usual routine, assuming everything was fine. That realization stung. I spent the whole weekend thinking about how much I had given to this relationship and how little I had gotten in return. I wasn't just upset about the anniversary or the airport incident anymore. I was upset about the bigger picture. Henry had never really cared to put me first. He had never seen me as his priority. When I came out of my weekend of reflection, I knew I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. I was emotionally exhausted, and if I stayed in this relationship, I would only keep getting hurt. So I planned one final conversation with Henry. This was it. I was going to lay everything out, once and for all, and set clear boundaries for what I needed if this relationship had any chance of survival. I decided to wait until the following weekend to have the conversation. Henry was going to be home, and I knew this would be the last chance for us to really talk. I was prepared to be direct, to tell him everything I had been holding in for so long. When the time came, I sat down with Henry in the living room. He could tell something was off, but I don't think he expected what was coming. I started by telling him that I couldn't keep going on in a relationship where I felt unappreciated. I've tried to communicate with you, I said, but nothing ever changes. You're always too busy, and I'm always the one making excuses for you. I can't do it anymore. Henry looked shocked. He couldn't believe I was saying all of this. He kept asking, why didn't you tell me sooner? I didn't realize things were this bad. It was like he was blindsided by everything I was saying. But at the same time, it was hard for me to feel sorry for him. How could he not realize it? How could he not see the toll his neglect was taking on me? He immediately shifted the blame back to me. You should have told me how you were feeling. I didn't know things were this bad. I thought everything was fine, he said. He made it sound like it was my fault for not being more vocal about how unhappy I was. That was the moment I realized how deeply out of touch he was with the state of our relationship. I've tried, Henry. Over and over again, I've tried to communicate, but you never listen, I said, trying to stay calm. You don't take my concerns seriously, and I've just been left feeling alone. I can't keep doing this. Henry didn't take it well. He begged me for another chance. I'll change, I swear. I'll put in more effort. I'll prioritize you. Please don't leave me. His voice was pleading now, and I could see the desperation in his eyes. For a moment, I almost wavered. But I knew I couldn't just let him keep making empty promises. He had been doing that for years. I'm willing to give it one last try, I said. But this time, things have to be different. I need you to actually show me that you can change. No more excuses. No more empty apologies. Henry agreed. But I wasn't convinced. His words were just that, words. Actions spoke louder, and I needed to see if he would follow through with anything he said. We talked about specific things he could do, making time for us, planning more thoughtful dates, actually being present when we were together. It was a simple list, but it was a start. The next few days were a mix of small but noticeable changes. Henry started planning dates again. They weren't huge, but they were thoughtful, and it was clear he was trying. He started being more present at home, taking the time to talk to me instead of retreating into his phone or the TV. It felt like a step in the right direction, but there was still a part of me that didn't fully trust that it would last. A few days later, Henry surprised me with a handwritten letter. He apologized for everything, acknowledged how much I had been carrying in the relationship, and said that he was committed to making real changes. I was shocked. This was the first time he had taken real responsibility for his actions, and it meant a lot to me. It was a step forward, but I still wasn't sure if it would be enough. I started feeling a glimmer of hope, but I stayed firm in my boundaries. I wasn't going to let myself fall into the same patterns. I had to see real, lasting change. For the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, things could get better. But I wasn't going to let my happiness depend solely on Henry. I had learned that much. So for now, I'm cautiously optimistic. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I'm in control of my own happiness, no matter what happens with him. If things improve, that's great. But if they don't, I'll be ready to walk away. The decision is in my hands now.